In some ways, no, because we do know that the Russian troops have been really poorly trained. They have almost no motivation. Some of them are not well fed. They're not well equipped. They didn't have a very good strategy. The intelligence that Putin had about the strength of his own forces vis-a-vis the Ukrainian forces was very, very poor because he himself had coup-proofed his regime and basically ousted really anyone with much expertise. And if you look at on the Ukrainian side, where they have a much more flexible, creative, motivated military that is just defending their land here. They're doing whatever it takes. They have a huge advantage in this regard. Russia, of course, is going to keep mobilizing more and more men, but I don't think any of this mobilization effort of those several 100,000 men is going to make any difference in a positive way on the Russian side.
And I'm interested in your thoughts on that because, as we see, you know, the annexation has been officially signed off today by Vladimir Putin. He's not responding to these Ukrainian gains, but he is outlining that there's going to be a regrouping of Russia's efforts. Do you think that is going to be possible?
Well, I think they're obviously going to try because what's taking place with these huge Ukrainian advances is causing some disarray within his own government. And we're seeing more and more people protesting, not just the general public, but also some within his elite group that may influence him in some ways. They are aware that this is not going well. And even there are reports that the media, the Russian media, is showcasing that they're aware that this is not going well. So Russia is going to want to try to save face and regain some of this territory that they've lost. Of course, they have a huge population that they can draw from. But just still getting back to my point, they don't have any kind of motivation, and they don't seem to know what they're doing. And as long as the West keeps supplying Ukraine with the types of advanced military weapons that they need, they're going to be able to push even further. I mean, they've made huge gains in the south in Kherson, taking over villages to the west of the Dnipro River, which then allow them to use small boats to advance and cutting off supply lines, targeting over 25,000 Russians. These types of gains keep happening deep in the south and the east. And that's all Russia had. So at the moment, this isn't going well at all for the Russians.
Yeah. The US has also just signed off on another multi-million-dollar package for Ukraine in terms of their war effort. Russia's warning the US against this, saying that they are now becoming part of the war. But are these empty threats in a way? Because Russia doesn't appear to be in any shape to be, doing anything against the United States.
And that's a really good question that I wouldn't know a certain answer to. I mean, we do know that what Putin is pursuing with his mobilization effort seems to be his first priority over using non-conventional weapons, using, the possibility of some sort of limited nuclear strike. So he seems to be pursuing the conventional route first, and of course, making these types of threats. The difficulty with assessing with what Putin is going to say, because his support group is so small, so those advisors that, might be pushing back on making bad decisions, it's very unclear what type of information that he's getting and whether or not he's surrounded by sycophantic types that are telling him that he can do whatever he wants to do. I mean, I would like to think that he's more rational and aware of what the repercussions would be if he were to cross that red line. But at the moment, I think he's just using this to threaten the U.S., to threaten the West, to try to get them to back down, because he knows that Western support has been really critical to turning the tide in this conflict with Ukraine.
Yeah. The EU is also set to look at fresh sanctions against Russia. Sanctions haven't necessarily bitten in the way they've wanted, though, have they?
No, they haven't, and it's very difficult for sanctions to have much bite, particularly when a country like Russia has natural resources that many countries in the world are dependent on, and also because Russia has support from countries in terms of trade, like China and to a lesser extent India. So they haven't been hit financially in the way that they would like. It has affected their ability to wage war, and it has led to a huge influx or exodus, I should say, of Russians, many flooding neighboring countries. Many of them were middle-class Russians who contribute to the economy. So this, in terms of the long term, is not good, but it often takes years and years for sanctions to have an effect. I mean, it's definitely causing economic disarray, but not to the extent that the West would have hoped.
Yeah. You're back from Tbilisi in Georgia, where you were doing research. What did you find? What did you encounter?
Well, one of the interesting things was just how many Russians have fled, and there were two stages of this migration effort. Those that were fleeing in March, right after the war started, that were really not necessarily against Putin or the regime or the conflict, but just were fleeing for economic reasons. But the ones that are fleeing right now are very young. They're scared for their lives. They only just have a huge backpack with them, and they don't know what they're going to do with themselves. They don't know if they're going to be able to return. And it's causing a lot of tensions in Georgia, of course. And so there are neighboring countries, the countries that neighbor Russia, that are actually very worried that Russia is going to attack them if things don't go well in Ukraine, because they're going to see that as a way of saving face. And Georgia in particular would be a more low-hanging fruit because its military isn't very well prepared at all.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because it does look like there is this exodus from Russia of people wanting to escape fighting in the war, and as you point out too, for economic reasons, which could also cause something of a humanitarian problem for those neighbouring countries.
It is, and definitely in the case of Georgia, where their economy is already struggling quite a bit. You see rent prices have tripled for those that were coming in since March. Hotel prices have tripled. It's created a huge housing crunch. And it's also just affected the prices of everything. Everything has gotten much more expensive for regular Georgian citizens, and this has made it really, really difficult. It's a country that's already struggling with unemployment and high levels of poverty. And I can imagine some of these other neighboring countries that are taking in this level of Russian migrants that are fleeing the conflict are facing similar economic challenges.
Yeah. Good to get your thoughts and experiences on that, Natasha. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.